it's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful, wonderful book, please visit watermelonhillbook.com, and that will also be in the description below. Memories. Of the memories from our farm on Watermelon Hill, many of them are sensory. There are indelible memories of sights, sounds, smells, taste, and touch. Some came from the earth, some from Mom's kitchen, the animals, even the air itself. I remember lying on my back on a sunny hilltop one fine spring day, just enjoying the warm breeze. It was the first day since winter that I had been allowed to take off my hated long johns. The air on my bare arms felt delicious. As I lay there daydreaming, watching the clouds, I could imagine all sorts of animals or objects in their shapes. Just like today's computer technology, they would morph from one shape into another as the wind shifted them. Lying there, I felt as if I were floating with them, while surrounded by the smell of grass, some far-off fields being burned for planting, the sounds of insects, the songs of birds. I could gladly have stayed there for hours. I know that sounds corny, but let yourself think back to childhood. Be honest with yourself and see if you don't have memories like that too. My brother Lawrence married a girl from near Boston and spent his young married life in Massachusetts. The first time he brought her home, he practically had to be the interpreter between our family's strong Appalachian accent and her strong Bostonian accent. We all love her, even though she is a Yankee. We forgive you, Shirley. Lawrence lived a long way from Kentucky, but came home as often as possible. He always insisted to his in-laws and friends that the skies in Kentucky were much bluer than they were in Massachusetts. I know he was prejudiced, but he was probably right. We had no industry and much fewer cars to pollute the air, so the skies probably really were bluer in Kentucky. On a clear night when there were no lights on, the stars were absolutely brilliant. The Milky Way looked as if it had been painted with a sweep of white paint from a gigantic spray gun. You can only see such sights when you are far away from all lights and in an area with no air pollution. Each season of the year had its own sensory inputs. In the springtime, the world turned green, with new growth popping out on every bush and tree. Growing here and there on the rock cliffs and in the woods was mountain tea, wintergreen. It could be boiled into a tasty tea, but I usually just chewed the leaves. They had a wonderful wintergreen flavor. I loved the smell of freshly turned earth. You could smell it from a surprising distance when a field was being plowed. It was a rich, natural smell, unlike anything else, as the dirt was exposed to the air for the first time in a year and mingled sometimes with the not altogether unpleasant smell of the horses pulling the plow. Birds always flocked to a newly turned field for the smorgasbord of worms and insects left exposed. Spring was the time for planting, with all the associated smells of fertilizer, both natural and chemical, along with flowers and fruit trees in bloom, and wild dogwoods, redbuds, and azaleas, all giving their splashes of color. Everything smelled and looked fresh, clean, and new. In the spring, the stalls in the barn were cleaned out, and the manure, which was mixed with hay by then, was used as fertilizer on the fields and the garden. Watermelon Hill was known for its great watermelons, and part of that was probably due to the way we planted them. For each hill of melons, we dug a hole more than a foot deep, dumped a bucket of manure in it, covered it over with dirt, and mounded up a hill about 2 feet in diameter by 4 inches high and flat on top. The soil of the hill was crumbled by hand, so there would be no hard clods to inhibit the young plant's growth. This method sometimes produced phenomenal results. Once after I'd moved away and was home for a visit, Dad said he had something he wanted to show me. He led the way to the garden and proudly showed me a watermelon plant with 25 large melons on it. I don't mean a watermelon hill, I mean one single plant. I carefully looked it all over, thinking Dad had made a mistake, but it was true. It must have covered a 400 square foot area. The summer was a hotter, lazier time with lots of insect sounds. Bees and June bugs buzzing around, butterflies fleeting across the fields, the night sounds of crickets, katydids, tree frogs, and the like, and moths flying around the porch lights. At night there were always the sounds of hoot owls or screech owls and the calls of whippoorwills, and in the day the bobwhite call of quail, and sometimes the jarring sound of cicadas, or as we called them, jarflies or locusts. They are an insect about 1 inch to 1.5 inches long that attach themselves to trees to shed their old shell. Some years they are out by the millions, and we refer to that as a locust year. Those years they were almost deafening when you were in the woods and loud even at the house. This was not one of the more endearing sounds of the country, but it was certainly memorable. City people usually think that the country is a very quiet place, but sometimes it is surprisingly noisy. There was one sight that I especially loved to see. You have probably seen it too. All the conditions had to be just right. It was usually near sunset and just after a rain, with just the right amount of clouds left in the sky. You may think I'm talking about a rainbow, but that would have been while the sun was higher in the sky and much more common. No, the conditions I described would sometimes produce a state where the world looked, for want of a better word, golden. It was as if everything was scrubbed so clean it glowed. I still stop whatever I'm doing and spend a few minutes watching when it happens. It is still always beautiful and peaceful, but it seemed even better back on the farm when I was young. Late summer and fall brought the sights and smells of harvesting time. Potatoes were dug and stored in the cellar or in a hole in the ground, lined with hay to protect them from freezing. Vegetables were picked and prepared for canning. Fruit trees were decorated with their brightly colored apples, peaches, plums, and cherries, and you could smell the fruit when you were near the trees. There is nothing like just reaching up and picking a snack right off the tree. The grapevines were loaded with clusters of purple grapes, blackberries and raspberries were hanging on the bushes, corn was cut and stacked in shocks in the field until it was taken to the barn, hay was cut and hauled to the barn or piled around a pole set in the ground out in a field in a haystack. Soon the leaves started to turn. They decorate the hills and the yard with red, yellow, and gold and fall like huge flakes of colored snow, making rustling noises as you walk through them. The nights are getting frosty and the days are starting to have a little nip, just enough to renew your energy after a long, hot summer. Winter was by far the quietest time of the year, with the absence of insects and frogs, but with the leaves all gone from the trees except the pines, sound traveled farther. If you were on a hilltop, you could easily hear a neighbor's dinner bell ringing, or some mother calling kids to supper, or the clanging of a cowbell in a far-off field. I thought it was interesting to see someone on a distant hill chopping down a tree. They might be so far away that they were barely discernible, but the sound of the axe carried clearly and echoed off the hills. It was easy to estimate how far away they were by how long it took the sound to reach my ears. It was strange to hear the sound of the blow when the axe was in the air getting ready for the next one. The air never smelled more clean, nor was the countryside more quiet than just after a snowfall. Everything was decorated with a clean blanket of white, and most birds and animals were still under cover and silent. Winter was the time to enjoy the absence of sensory input, or at least a muted version. After a fresh snowfall, we often made snow cream, similar to ice cream. Just dip up a big pan of clean snow and mix with milk or cream, vanilla, sugar, and eggs. I can taste it now. There was one sound, not heard often, but which was unforgettable by all who heard it. For a period of a few years at night, we sometimes heard the call of a panther or some sort of large wild cat. It may have been a bobcat, but it sure sounded bigger than that. I can't possibly describe it well enough to convey the true emotion this sound stirred in all who heard it, but it was an utterly unearthly, high-pitched scream, as you might imagine a demented woman would sound if she was being tortured to death. The sound would really carry in the still night air as it echoed off the hills. It was a long, drawn-out shriek, rising then falling and ending in almost a cough. That was the one sound that if you were out in the woods at night would literally make the hair stand up on your head. Possibly it was the sound of the big cats mating. If you have ever heard common house cats mating, just amplify it by about 100 times, throw in some vibrato and echo, place yourself in the dark woods on a remote farm with a graveyard in the background, and you may begin to appreciate the true quality of the sound as we heard it. Surprisingly, none of the family attributed it to anything supernatural, but accepted it for what it undoubtedly was. There was also a sight which could have seemed eerie to some who were not used to it. Our farm was bordered by a river, and many nights there was dense fog all up and down the Big Sandy, making driving on the local roads very slow and dangerous. The fog would begin at the river level, filling in the valleys and hollows first, then rise into the higher elevations. Some nights it would not reach our farm, but when it did, it was like a scene from an old horror movie. The fog would roll in, first just along the ground, then rise higher and higher. If the night was still, it stayed in a cleanly defined layer as it rose. You could walk through it, and vision would be unobstructed at eye level, but obscured at ground level. We had fun with visitors from town sometimes, taking them for a walk at night when the fog was rolling in. We would tell them ghost stories, then as we came to the graveyard, we would either scare them or run off and leave them there. Sometimes we would take them on a snipe hunt. If you don't know what a snipe hunt is, ask your dad or grandpa. I'm sure they will be glad to show you, so I don't want to ruin the experience for you or them. There is one sight that is etched in my memory that no one else saw. During a thunderstorm, after looking through some books upstairs, I was just starting back down when a brilliant blue zigzag of lightning flashed through the house at the base of the stairs. Amazingly, there was no noticeable damage, but I'll never forget it. I vividly remember all the sights, sounds, and smells of Watermelon Hill and the different seasons. I wish I could experience them again. Once in a while, I will be in a place or situation where some smell or sound will bring back a memory, and I try to write it down to include here. I hope I have portrayed some of these memories well enough so that they can be visualized by the reader. Bounce and Freddie. We always had dogs on Watermelon Hill, not 20 or 30 like our neighbor George Riggs, but sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. They usually fell into one of 4 classifications. They were tracking dogs for rabbits or foxes, treeing dogs for squirrels, a combination for coons or possums, or a dog that wasn't really any good for anything except that he was a pet. On a farm, a hunting dog that could help earn his keep was the most desirable and valuable, but we still had pets too. None of our dogs were anywhere near to being purebred unless they were purebred mongrels, but they each had their own traits and talents and were special in some way. The one exception was a black cocker spaniel named, you guessed it, Blackie. When I was about 10, my brother Curtis and his wife Janie gave her to me. One of their neighbors had to get rid of her, so they brought her to the farm. She was a good pet, but seemed to lead a double life. She would seem to be perfectly happy, then out of the blue she would disappear, sometimes for weeks at a time, then just as suddenly come back home. I think she had probably adopted another home somewhere as she was roaming the countryside and was splitting her time between us. I saw her once as she was leaving and called her to come back. She stopped, came a few steps, then started away again. Every time I called her, she seemed to be making a hard decision. It was like she wanted to stay, but knew it was time for her to go again. Finally, she left one time and never returned. I really missed her, but by that time I had become somewhat hardened to the sad reality that pets are not forever. Several years earlier, we had a long-haired dog that was almost entirely white. We called her Snowball. She was a pet that one of my older brothers claimed, but of course I played with her too. When I was about 5, Snowball had puppies, and 2 of them were almost identical. They were mostly white with some brown on their ears and had medium-length hair. I fell in love with them instantly and begged to keep them. After some discussion between Mom and Dad, they finally consented, and I had my very own dog, 2 of them. I don't remember where I got the names, but I named them Bounce and Freddie. Of course, they had to stay with their mother most of the time at first, but I still got to play with them some, and after they were weaned, they were my constant companions. We roamed the fields together, chasing grasshoppers, pretending to hunt, or just playing. Wherever I was, you could be sure that Bounce and Freddie were not far away. It was a very happy time that you think is never going to end when you are 5 years old. During the late 40s and a couple of times in the 50s, there was an outbreak of rabies in eastern Kentucky. A lot of wild animals were infected with it, and sometimes tame animals that tangled with the wild ones got bitten and infected. Hardly anyone in our part of the country had their dogs vaccinated against rabies, or even taken to a vet for that matter, so they were all vulnerable. Everyone had heard of the danger of being bitten by raccoons or foxes and tried not to let their dogs roam away from home, but sometimes a dog would still get bitten. Everyone was taught the symptoms of rabies: frothing at the mouth, stumbling, acting vicious and ill-tempered, and we were told to be on the lookout for animals with any of those symptoms. One day, just such a dog came through our farm, dripping foam from its mouth, crazy and spoiling for a fight, attacking anything it came across. Bounce and Freddie were unlucky enough to be in its way. They usually stayed near the house, and I saw the fight start in the yard. Dad was home and shot the rabid dog, but Bounce and Freddie had both been bitten. I thought surely they would be all right since they didn't seem to be hurt much, but Mom and Dad broke the news to me that they would have to be destroyed. I couldn't believe it, wouldn't accept it. Surely something could be done if they really wanted to. I cried and begged, but when I saw Dad going back outside with the rifle, I knew it was no use. I ran upstairs to the opposite side of the house and cried like I was going to die myself. I covered my ears but still heard the rifle shots. It felt like they were ripping through my own heart. Don't let anyone tell you that a child will soon get over the loss of a pet. That may be true in some cases, but even now it is a little difficult for me to write about this. I remember it like it was yesterday. I think I was about 14 when I first saw the movie Old Yeller, and it really brought the memory back. If you have never seen it and don't know what I mean, please rent it. You will understand. I guess I thought I hated my dad for quite a while after that, but I finally came to realize that he had no choice. It had to be done, and I'm sure it hurt him to do it, but when you're 5, you can't see the big picture. All you know is that you lost your pets, your best friends. Kind of a sad place to stop, but we'll stop right there for today. I loved all Dale's memories of the different pets. Of course, not his beloved little ones, the 2 that ended with on a really sad note, but they certainly reminded me of the different pets that we've had over the years. Ones that my brothers had, one that my Papa Wade had, like thinking of dogs, hunting dogs. And then Matt and Corey and Katie, since we've been a family, the ones we've had, various different ones. Probably the 2 that meant the most to us was Wilma, was a little beagle. And I felt kind of like Dale did there when even though I was a grown-up, but cried and carried on and was so saddened over it. But coyotes got her is what happened to her. She didn't get rabies or anything, but coyotes killed her. And we took her to the vet, but there was really nothing he could do about it. And then Ruby Sue we had for 14 years. We probably had Wilma for about 6 years or something like that before the coyotes got her. And since she was a beagle, she loved to chase rabbits, and that's how they got her. She made a lot of noise like most beagles when she was chasing rabbits. And then Ruby Sue was a little rat terrier. We had her for 14 years, and she had developed diabetes, and she died. So, but you get attached to them, just like Dale said, and it's hard to understand when you're 5. I'm sure, because sometimes it's hard to understand when you're a grown up. Times were so different then, of course, when Dale was young, and that was one of the reasons he wrote the book, to show those differences and kind of preserve his memories and tell about his family and what life was like. But in those days, you really had to worry about rabies. That was a real fear. Today, not so much. Most people that have animals, they do get them vaccinated. They get shots for rabies. So it's just not like it was then. There's wildlife officers today. If you see a raccoon acting kind of funny, you can call and they'll come take care of it and do what needs to be done. So it's not near the issue that it was when Dale was young, but his father and him and everybody, like he said, they taught kids in an early age what to look for, to be on the lookout and to know, because it was just something that they had to worry about. I love the opening of this part of the book when Dale's talking about laying up there and looking at the clouds and letting them morph together, and you can just almost feel like you were there with him, and brought back so many memories of mine. I love to do that, thinking about sitting and watching the creek. I have that same feeling. I, of course, have watched clouds, sit on the back porch and watch clouds. Reminds me of laying out in the sun when I was a girl. It's not good for you. You shouldn't do it, but I sure did it a lot when I was a young teenager. And I love just being outside and watching whether it was the trees or the clouds or the sun, just such wonderful, just amazement. You can just do that and feel so peaceful and feel in such awe of everything. I love to go to the ocean. I love to go and sit on the beach and watch the ocean. I never get tired of that. So many thoughts. It's wonderful, like Dale's saying, just to be able to do that. And sadly, as adults, most of the time when you got to do that, you were children. But we should all sneak off and do it when we can. Slip off away from everybody and all your work duties and do it whenever you can, whether you're looking at the sky like Dale was, or at the ocean, or at a creek, or whatever it is. Him talking about his family, teasing kind of about his sister-in-law there, calling her a Yankee. Lots of Granny's family, a lot of them married down here, so both pairs were down here, both spouses, but then they moved up north for work like that. And him talking about his brother coming home reminded me of them. The ones that did move away, they would come back, of course, for vacation. Seemed like it was always in the summer they would come, and it was always big doings at Granny Gazzy's when they would come, because there'd be cousins to play with that wasn't always there, and of course lots of laughter and jokes and everybody getting to spend time with each other. And of course today it's still like that. If you have to move away from home, when you get to come home, I think of my nephew Mark and my niece April. They're not living here in our area any longer, so when they get to come, we're so excited. We were so excited last Christmas that we were all together again. Everyone got to be there, and it was so wonderful. So those things still go on today. And the seasons that Dale talked about really spoke to me, because that's one of my favorite things about living in the mountains of Appalachia where I live, is those distinct seasons, and something so special about each of them. You think of in the spring, I guess this is late spring, very late spring, just about to be technically summer, although it feels like summer. But think about green up, from the first little green tinge I can see over on the ridge until all of a sudden everything's greened up. Last weekend on mine and Corey's trip to Virginia, just being able to look at the lushness between here and there. True, I mean, green ups happened a good while back here, but that's one of my favorite things each year, is to look at that. I jotted down some other things though, thinking about what he said. The garden, plowing the garden. Oh, I do love that. Smell of that rich dirt being turned over. That's just one of the best smells in the world. It reminds me of being a little girl at Pap's big garden, but I still love the smell, even in mine and Matt's garden. And then all those wonderful summer sounds, think about the jar flies and bees and birds. Especially Matt don't like the bees because they like him, but I love to hear bees buzzing, especially in a cornfield. That's one of my favorite places. Katydids are not calling yet here. The crickets, the frogs. When I was growing up, there was a pond down below Granny and Pap's house. It's not there now. Been filled in for the way of progress, I guess. But that was just part of life in the summer, hearing the frogs around that pond, whether it's the big bullfrogs or the little cheepers. Definitely part of my childhood summers. And then Dale mentioned the moths that would come to the light. We called them millers, but the millers, seemed like there were so many more millers in those days. They'd just be out there beating themselves against the porch light if the light was on. Definitely part of summers though. And then the birds that he mentioned, the whippoorwills, I love, I adore. I've been hearing them this year, and typically around our house we only have one or two, but I love them. I look forward to them. and the doves, and he mentioned the screech owl. I've not heard a screech owl in a long time, but it actually sounds like a horror movie. So if you hear one, it's like an eerie sound, and there's all kinds of old folklore from Appalachia about what happens if you hear one. And then also you think about after summer, the glory of summer, well then those wonderful fall things that Dale mentioned, from the leaves to the harvest. Him talking about the potatoes reminded me of one time I was helping Granny harvest the rest of our potatoes, and it was going to come a storm, and we were running around like crazy trying to beat the rain and get them all in, and we did. And then when it was over, I told her, I said, oh, I feel like we're on Little House on the Prairie, and we just saved the day. And she thought that was so funny. She couldn't wait till Pap got home so she could tell him what I said. But and of course, fall is the time for apples. Western North Carolina is bountiful with apples, so you think about those in the fall too. But then in the winter, there's a beautifulness about the winter. The green leaves are gone, the colored leaves are gone, the trees are bare, but it's still lovely, still beautiful. Just the starkness of the trees mixed in with the evergreens that keep their leaves, just beautiful. And then the snow, I don't get much snow, I wish I did, but things are so silent and soft, and it just covers everything with that beautiful layer of white. Wonderful. And then the snow cream, of course. If you've never had snow cream and you live somewhere where it snows, you must make snow cream. There's a recipe, me and Jim both felt so strongly about it. There's even a recipe in our cookbook. It couldn't be more simpler to make, but we felt like it should be included. The mention of the panther, so many painter, you'll hear painter here, so many painter stories. And I have seen one time on Franklin Mountain with Pap. Me and Pap saw it. No denying what it was. Absolutely. It was a good view. It walked right in front of our car. There was just no mistaking it. But I've never heard one. Now, Katie has a story about hearing one. And then recently, someone else told me about hearing one, and about how terrifying, just like Dale described. It's a sound like you just can't imagine. I was actually at home when Katie heard the one that she heard, or what she thinks was one. Terrified her, but I was dead to the world asleep. We'd been traveling that day. Matt was sick with the flu, or he might have heard it. This has been several years back, but Katie describes it kind of like Dale did. And then another kind of sensory thing he talks about is the fog. The mountains are known for the fog. So, fog is really common here, and common for it to be very foggy and not even be able to see when you're driving, but also just kind of to be wisping on the mountains is so beautiful. And I've often heard people say, I didn't grow up with this, but I really like it, is that when you see that, when it's kind of wisping up the mountains, that's the groundhogs making their coffee, making their morning coffee. I always liked that when I first heard it, and I've always remembered it. And then, of course, if you've never been took on a snipe hunt, I've been took on a snipe hunt. And I'll go ahead and tell you, let the cat out of the bag. Dale kind of alluded to it, but there is no snipe. They take you somewhere and leave you. So I've been took on a snipe hunt one time when I was young with a bunch of other screaming girls, and kind of a slumber party from church, and some of the old women, it was all women, but some of the women took us on a snipe hunt, and it was really just down the driveway from the person's house we were staying at, and then run off and left us, took the flashlights and left us. And lots of fun though, lots of screaming, as you might imagine, with young girls being scared, but it was all in fun. And those, I love, at the time I just thought it was fun. But today I love thinking back to that, and I need to ask those ladies, who took you snipe hunting? Who talked to you about it? Was it your grandpa? Was it your grandma? Some church lady that pulled the joke on you? A very common thing for youngsters in Appalachia to be took on a snipe hunt, and it's really just kind of a practical joke. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you. And I hope, as always, that you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next with Dale on Watermelon Hill.